جميرو سكاب حزي بتختاتالي ببي إروانو مسوعة الناس زخفلو سوعتنا انكاب قدم جميرو سكاب حزي بمن النتو استقتلو كلهم تقارونا سمعتاتنا اندا ذكرنا نري نجمرو زلنا مدد نجمر قدي سلازقونا كلنا حفنا بدوتا قوبع زقبرنا قوبعنا قليعنا ولباب زقبرنا ولبابنا ون قليعنا ሃይማኖታዊ ግዴታ አንተ ኮይኑ ንሱ አቦቱን ከሎ ማለት እዩ ደውልና ዝኽረ ስዋዕትና ዝኽረ ሰማዕታትና ንግበር ንሓደ ደቂቅ رفتي كبراتنا دقيمنا نقعد عن مساخو من نبلكم لما عنتي نزي زلنا له جزي زمتن بزعبا زي زلنا يو جزيون فوق زخونه مبرهي هبونا زخلو غاشا حزنا متينا لنا ازون غاشانا مستقراي ازيون نوح جزي ركب زنبرو من أما حبرسب تجراي أزيوم بتصبق زفلتون أليكس دواليو بزعبا أليكس دوال دحرة بايتا كمون دما بزبادسة أفاليتو نام مدرخ دبخ كبلنا نكبر حونا نسلي مدرخنا ألف كبر حاو سلي مدرخنا أتا
غني لي طبعا خاتمها بتكون لهم نحن لهم قدم بيت مدلاوات هم نقبر لنا طريق لهم كل سبب تعمل سحوا اجندات هم يقولوا نحلف قدم جساتين يرميرو قدم مدالوي تيم اج بدايزي فتم مفتحونا وين قبل الحزب لا يملكتهم يوم اقداش انه لمدات ازلا كنغطينا بيت اجندات اليومنا بتخداتالي لما عندنا ساعات لو تسلي لو أوروباي أمريكاي أفتح لنا يوم مفالتي بالتسلي نورا أوروبا لهم حواتنا كلا بخارج خاولة أمريكا وزاي أنت ترى ساعات جيجا يغري كان حتى تقدمنا تركوا لصنيعهم إلى ندمت جنا لما عندي مدى عوي مدى تدري لنا بوليتيكا أولاو مثل إثيوبيا نورث تحيزو مسؤولة هزل لنا يقنعات الحوار له تايكل قبرنينا تايم المسؤول تمدلات تشالنجز محل خاطر تايم المسؤول كيف حبينا المعدسك نغاغرينا على السؤال اللي تفضلوا يلهمي الى يقمت محازات تግራይ فتره تግራይ هنا انه زي سم حزب تግራይ دمسل هنا حونا أيوة مالتي مو بزح من اللي يكبري تو لما أنت مجاورة بالإنجليزية يكون مالتيو التفاعل الميدياتات كبر يجوا لو يوم بس لا وداول الحلف كل يوم ثاني حملة بيكر الحلف كل يوم مالتي مو لتم جيل تجور لهم ميديا كلهم جيل لهم قيمة بتوكيم كان يكبر الجيل. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for joining us. I was just introducing you as you didn't expect. I didn't have much to add into what the general public knows about who Alex is. So without further ado, I'm going to divulge into the topic of the day. We're going to cover a lot of issues that you are intimately familiar with, but that has been in the minds of our community, not just the community in the diaspora, but in Tigray, the rest of Ethiopia, and elsewhere as well. And these are very serious matters. Given what we went through over the last 2.5 to 3 years, we are in a political environment, a political and security environment that needs a thorough reflection, an in-depth reflection, and a critical reflection from within our community and among our friends as well. And who better than Alex to join and reflect on this. So welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Solomon. It's a pleasure, privilege to be with you. And I will give some general reflections, and then perhaps we can go to a question and answer, a more open discussion. But let me start off by, as I always am sadly obliged to do, by offering my condolences and commiserations, because the people of Tigray have been walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And we hope that you are climbing out of that valley. But it is a difficult climb. And as the active war ends, and the shadows begin to lift as communications begin to be re-established, it's only then that so many of you and us know truly the losses that have been suffered. So it is a very difficult and painful period. I want to make one sort of prefatory remark, and then I want to take a sort of broad context about looking at where Ethiopia and Tigray are today, where the region is, where the international community is, and conclude with what we can think about doing. So my opening remark is that it was a couple of years ago that President Joe Biden recognized the Armenian genocide. It took over 100 years for the US government to do that. And why did it take so long? It took so long, first of all, because it took a long while for the facts and the documentation to be properly, widely known and acknowledged. Secondly, because the argument was muddied, because the Armenians during World War I were fighting a war. They were fighting against the Turks who inflicted the genocide, and many of them were actually fighting alongside the enemies of the Ottoman Turks, namely the Russians. And for those who were making the argument that this was a genocide, the correct argument, they were always facing the problem of those who argued, well, the Armenians were not innocent either. And it took a long time for the logic of the reality of it being a genocide to break through that point, valid though it was. And thirdly, of course, it was the importance of Turkey to US foreign policy. But the Biden administration did the right thing in recognizing the Armenian genocide. Now, of course, you immediately will draw the parallel, and let us hope that it is not going to take 106 years for similar recognition of the sufferings of the people of Tigray to be properly acknowledged at the highest level in Washington, DC and internationally. So looking at the current context in the broad picture of what is happening in Ethiopia, and we can get into details in the question and answer. But the broad picture, I would say, is characterized by one general trend and one very specific set of specific development. The general trend is that Ethiopia is looking like what we might call a normal or paradigmatic African state. It's looking a bit like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Cameroon, or any other states. And the nature of governance that is being operated, implemented by the federal government, and actually throughout most of the country, has many of the characteristics of, you'll see I have many books in my bookshelf about African politics, and if you look at the classic books, for example, from Jean-Francois Bayard's Politics of the Belly, he will describe the state in Cameroon or Congo as having a set of characteristics about personal rule, a personal ruler who presents one face to the outside world and a different face to his constituents, his subjects at home, who operates on the basis of patronage, on circulating elites in and out of power, giving them just enough access to power, material reward to keep them on side, but always knowing that or making sure that they always know that they are dependent upon his largesse. The dismantling of institutions, the licensing of kleptocracy, the dispersal of the means of violence throughout the society, so that no one national army or special force or militia is strong enough to challenge the leader, the dismantling of infrastructure that would allow people to organize. All these are characteristics of the paradigmatic African state. And for many people in the political elite in Ethiopia and in the region and around the world, and I'll get on to the region and the rest of the world, that's good enough. That's fine. They don't want Ethiopia to achieve the sort of exceptional status to which it has historically aspired. And they're quite happy for the institutions that made Ethiopia into being the anchor of peace and stability in the region, and provided for 25 years of unprecedented growth. They're happy for those institutions to become dismantled and personalized. And Prime Minister Abiy is a very skilled transactional politician, and he is able to survive on this basis. And of course, insofar as he has any power of choosing who will be in provincial or regional governments, including in Tigray, he will veto those who challenge that system and choose those who are ready to go along with that approach. That exceptionalism, just a word on exceptionalism, and I'll talk about Ethiopian exceptionalism, but there's also a sense in which we need to think about Tigrayan exceptionalism too. The Ethiopian exceptionalism was the prevailing view that Ethiopia had a particular sort of blessing from God. It was a state that was thousands of years old, that would endure no matter what. And that was both an asset and a liability. It was an asset because a skilled leader could utilize that reverence for stateness among the Ethiopian population to help establish institutions. It was a liability because many took it too seriously. And then as Ethiopia becomes a failed state, as it is today, or a semi-failed state, that comes about in part because people many people take it for granted Ethiopia cannot collapse, cannot become like Congo or Cameroon. But of course it can. It has in the past at different times, and can do so again. And I think the Tigrayan community in particular needs also to attend to how the ideas about Tigrayan exceptionalism have been constructed through a particular history, and they have a particular value, and they are manifest in certain ways, but they can also be a liability, a problem if we fail to see or recognize the extremely hard work and hard political work that is necessary to sustain what has been politically most valuable, the greatest political assets that Tigray has had, including its army, its self-discipline, etc. Those things cannot be taken for granted. The other point that I want to make in terms of sort of Ethiopia's trajectory towards becoming a, characteristic, quotes, normal African state is that what we see elsewhere in the region is that when there's a war, and a particularly vicious war, the institutions of those who quotes win the war can become as shattered, as dismantled, as fragmented as those who lose. So this happened in Somalia in the 1980s. It happened in Sudan in the 2000s with the war in Darfur. That the shock of waging a war, even if you come out as the so-called winner, can actually destroy your institution and can create the sort of turmoil, anarchy, etc. that we see. We saw that in another case in Africa, is Biafra. The Nigerian federal state never recovered from winning the Biafra war. So that in the short term, what I would expect if this general picture is correct is some material benefits being allowed to flow to Tigray in response as the Tigrayan leadership does the things that are considered acceptable by the leadership in Addis Ababa and internationally. So genuine material benefits. Let's not minimize what it means for people to have more food, to have the electricity supply more regular, to have the banks opened, etc. But not in the context of returning to where we were, in the context of establishing a different kind of political system. Now, moving to the region is perfectly happy with this. I deliberately cast the realities of Congo and Cameroon in negative terms because many African leaders, including the leaders of the African Union, would say, "Hey, are you saying that Congo and Cameroon are not good enough? Isn't it racist or imperialists to talk them down?" To which my response would be, let's be realistic. Is it not actually unacceptable if your bar of success, your bar of what is acceptable, is the state of countries such as this today? Of course, there are some in the region who relish this. Someone who never subscribed to the Abyssinian myth was Isaias Afwerki. His ambition was always to be the king of kings, or perhaps to be more precise in the Ethiopian historical context, the lord over a new era of the princes, when central authority is integrated in Ethiopia. He is on the record as having described Ethiopia as a, quote, overdressed Zaire. So he is quite happy to see it's what he likes and what he wants. And others who are now the dominant actors in the wider region, those in the Gulf, particularly in the Emirates, to a certain extent in Saudi Arabia as well. This is how they see the world. They see the states on their peripheries as consisting of leaders who should come as supplicants to their courts in Abu Dhabi, in Riyadh, wherever, and ask for money, and in return they get favors and blessings. But as we know, the governance in the Emirates or Saudi is not run on an institutional basis; it's run on a family basis, and that's how they expect their client states in the wider region to behave. Internationally, let me say a couple of things about where Ethiopia and Tigray stand in the international order at the moment. I think the number one lesson that is being learned internationally from what happened last year is that famine works. Starvation as a tool of war works. It can drive a people to the brink of such desperation that they accept what they would, under any other circumstances, have considered unacceptable. And somehow, at an international level, despite all the norms and principles and conventions in the international community for the last 70 years, the leaders have said, okay, that's fine, we will accept that. The African Union has essentially dismantled its own norms and principles. If you look at the norms and the procedures in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, the protocol for setting up the Peace and Security Council, you will see actually subtly, but very, very clearly, they have been abandoned. And this brings me on to the point I want to make about the US administration with regard to Africa, which is relevant to the recent visit of the Secretary of State to Addis Ababa. So the Biden administration decided last year to have a US African Leaders Summit in Washington, and it would invite all the African leaders in good standing with the African Union. So those who were suspended for various reasons, and it says Afwerki were not invited, but everybody else, including Prime Minister Abiy, was invited. In preparing for that, there was some debate as to what the strategy for this summit should be, and a proposal was made by a retired African statesman that the line that President Biden should take should be this: he should take several documents, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which has, amongst other things, norms like objecting to unconstitutional changes in government, the norm of inclusion of the people in the affairs of the Union, the norm of non-indifference, which is the African Union will not accept genocide or crimes against humanity. He would take the principles in the protocol of the Peace and Security Council, the principles in the Convention on Democracy, Governance and Elections, etc. And he would hold these up and he would say, yes, leaders of Africa, I have read the documents that you have solemnly signed, the treaty principles you have committed yourself to them, and I like them. We, as the United States, we believe in ending impunity. We believe in democracy. We believe in human rights. We believe in all these things. And it's all here. Welcome. This is the basis on which we will have our partnership. He didn't do that. What he actually did was he essentially said, what we mean by African leadership, African solutions, is whatever you guys choose to do. Whatever President Obasanjo, Commissioner Musa Faki, whatever you decide is an African solution, we will accept that. And that was essentially conniving in the dismantling of all the effort that was made in the time of the African Renaissance, and the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide, the civil wars in Congo and Sierra Leone, etc., and saying, okay, we'll go back to the old days when, because there was a global competition in the days of the Cold War for the allegiance of African states, we will get down dirty and we will play these same games as the Chinese and the Russians are playing. In my view, that is a shocking regress, and shocking for both morally, because it is saying we will accept the low standards. We will take that as a given. I think that's racist. I think that if you want to talk about imperialism and racism, it's to say, okay, you Africans, if Congo is the best you can do, that's fine with us. And that should be fine with your people. I find that unacceptable. But also, I think it is a strategic blunder, because the United States remain, and Europe for that matter, remain constrained by rule of law and democratic transparency. So that when it comes to deploying force, the US is never going to behave in the way that the Wagner Group is behaving in Mali or Central African Republic. It's never going to open its suitcases full of cash in the way that the Emiratis are able to do, and simply buy loyalty. You can't do that. And so the US and Europeans are playing at a disadvantage vis-a-vis more unscrupulous players. So the advantage that the Western democracies have is precisely those norms and principles that the Africans have aspired to and have signed up to. And if the Western leadership says, we don't care about those either, we're going to play the same game as the Russians and the Chinese and the Emiratis, of course, we are consigning the Western countries to being relevant only insofar as they can as they can play that same transactional politics. So let me now come back to what this means for those of us who are concerned with those norms and principles in the particularly acute situation of Tigray today. And I would say that there are many things that can be done, because the people's aspiration for something better remains undimmed. So there's the issue of accountability, which begins with documenting. Accountability is not simply bringing people to court. Accountability begins with recognizing the dignity, the humanity of those who have suffered, including those who passed away, and telling their stories frankly and candidly, and saying, this was not your fault. This was something inflicted upon you. That is the first element of accountability, and everything else follows from that, including prosecutions, including and some things that we, I think, need to look at in terms of restitution and reparations. And there's a particular agenda here that is relevant internationally. It's not obviously the most severe violation that has been suffered by the people of Tigray, but it is one that it gives us, I think, leverage, which is the fact that Western taxpayers, through their contribution to aid budgets, contributed to a lot of the infrastructure in Tigray over the years. So the UK's Department for International Development, the USAID, the World Bank, etc., put a lot of money into, let us say, the water supply for Mekelle. And the state of Ethiopia came and it stole those things, which were paid for by the taxpayers' dollars of these countries. Now, should the World Bank, should the United States, should the UK be putting their money back through that same governmental structure to rebuild those same things? Surely that's wrong, and surely that's something that the authorities in Washington, London, Brussels, Paris, etc., will recognize is wrong. So there is an opportunity there for exploring a different way of doing business. So on the basis of recognizing that there's culpability, there's restitution, there's reparations that are needed. A similar issue, which is more grievous, which is, I don't know how many thousands of children were born of rape. These children are totally innocent, but they are their presence is extremely painful to their mothers, their siblings, their families, their communities. These children were born of the state. This was a state policy that these children should be born. So surely it is the responsibility of the state in Addis Ababa, and also the state in Asmara, to care for these children and their wider families. It cannot be the responsibility of those upon whom the atrocity of state rape was inflicted. There are many issues that we can explore here. Getting on to the issue of humanitarian assistance, which will become a priority. There was a meeting, as I'm sure many of you know, in Mekelle just 2 days ago, at which a whole range of NGOs came together to discuss how urgent assistance and rehabilitation should be designed and programmed. And what I gather is there's been remarkably little thinking gone into the prioritization and the strategies for assisting and rebuilding Tigray. And I think the foundational point here has to be that those who enable the survival of the Tigrayan people as individuals, as families, as communities, during these many months in the valley of the shadow of death, were the people, the communities themselves. They went, I mean, outsiders contributed a bit, but only a tiny bit. The formal authorities contributed next to nothing. It was the people who did this for themselves. And it is the people who ought to be facilitated to do it for themselves going forward, bypassing all the levels of authority that up to now have shown neither responsibility nor capability to do what is necessary. And then we get to, and this is really my final point, which is the point of institutions. The institutions emerging from this war are shattered on all sides. And the temptation will be to allow what remains of these institutions, particularly those at local level, to wither, and for there to be a sort of scramble for the resources that come through Addis Ababa and so on, and allowing the rules of what I call the political market, the scramble for these bits of resources, to further erode those principles of solidarity, of equity, of companionship and equality in struggle, and equality in facing extreme hardship. We must make sure that those institutions are protected and preserved, and not further dismantled at this time. So let me leave it there, and I will ask Solomon to begin to pose some of the many questions that I'm sure he has. a few of which I may be able to answer in part.
Yes, thank you, Alex. And that was a very insightful remark and frames our conversation. So there are so many issues that you raised, which I will intermingle with some of the questions I have already pushed forward by colleagues and compatriots. So when you bring the development of instruments to avoid the pragmatic state and bring the meeting of minds, particularly during the time of the late Prime Minister, was there a plan B? If the Congo and Cameroon were to evolve, were there any safety nets other than the instruments that you have in mind, which were nascent by then, which was just in the development? And now, fast forward, so are we doomed, given the geopolitical alignment in the forces that has come to be? Are we doomed? Keep that in mind, and then I will start with some of the questions that have already been forwarded.
Okay.
So it took months to form the interim regional administration. Given the severity and immediacy of the humanitarian crisis, the government should have been formed within days, if not hours. What did you attribute this to? The reaction from different interested parties, and particularly the constituent, there have been mixed ones, and the disillusionment of that. Some people say the ruling parties, particularly, this is attributed to the level of wisdom and political maturity in Tigray. Maybe the one that you mentioned about exceptionalism. It's deliberative, and the constituents are fully behind the vanguard party. And the tradition, one should trust that at the end it will play out well. For instance, the election of which confirmed of Getachew that chair the TPLF, and by extension the interim administration. Others argue it simply is a paralysis, a group stuck with folks at the helm with no vision and direction, a natural outcome of a terrible deal in Pretoria. Others say lack of political tradition, of accountability, and in the absence of independent institutions that can master pressure and influence. And of course, a 3 year of iteration, war, fatigue, the population. What's your take?
Okay. So, actually, let me begin at the beginning. There wasn't a safety net. There wasn't a plan B, and we can explore the history of that, but it is only now. It is now history, and I think perhaps one of the under-acknowledged failings of the period when Mellus was in personal power was the neglect of Tigray. Tigray and the TPLF were actually allowed to wither, and the traditions that had existed before that were not cultivated. And I suppose one of the reasons for that is everyone thought, okay, the past is the past. The next generation don't need to get into politics. The political issues have been resolved. The next generation should become engineers and doctors and teachers and so on, because that's what we need for development. And we sort of neglected the politics. Are we doomed? No, of course not. I mean, what we saw 2021 was a capacity for collective mobilization and struggle in endurance that far surpassed what anyone had foreseen and predicted. And of course, there is an exhaustion now, but but many of the principles and the norms and ethics internalized and relearned during that period are still highly relevant. Not that there should be a return to war, but the same sense that it was the people who led the war or led the resistance now can translate into it has to be the people who lead the recovery, and the conditions in Ethiopia, in the region, internationally, are very difficult and unpropitious, but nothing was as difficult and unpropitious as it was 2 years ago. So why did it take so long for these steps to be taken? I think the basic reason for it was that if we look at how the agreement came about in Pretoria, Abiy, of course, didn't want Pretoria to happen at all, nor did Obasanjo and the African Union. They basically had set up the African Union mediation as a foil for keeping everybody else out so that they could pursue a military solution. And it was only an unexpected combination of circumstances that allowed Pretoria to happen at all. And it was the pressure on Moussa Faki to say, oh, we're doing something. And then it was Uhuru Kenyatta responding to that by saying, yes, we're going to move, and forcing the hand of Moussa Faki and Obasanjo to have the meeting in Pretoria. And then the delegation from Tigray taking that opportunity and saying, this is our only chance for negotiation. And whatever one thinks of how they negotiated, the fact is that was their only chance for a negotiation. Otherwise, it was going to be decided on the battlefield. And so Abiy didn't know what to do with the agreement, that having, as it were, been forced into it. Although the agreement is extremely favorable to him, it was not what he was expecting or wanting. And what it did was it provided him with, it released the international pressure. This pressure had been building on him over Tigray. He had to do something about Tigray. And it wasn't his plan A, but it was what he had. And the Americans immediately got off his back. And so he felt no pressure at all. And he could continue Abiy doesn't strategize. There's no indication of any strategy other than just different tactics stitched together. So his tactic is always to play for the day. And he was playing repeatedly for the day to try and get, in the good books of Biden, of the World Bank, dealing with his other constituents, dealing with Isaias, Tigray was just one of those problems and not the priority one, because it had been, the most urgent issues had been resolved. So I think that we could go into the sort of week-to-week details of why it took so long, but essentially Abiy is no longer interested in solving real problems. He never was really, but he's not. He's interested in managing problems so they're not a political threat to him. And he would have been happy for this sort of no war, no peace, not quite return to normality to continue for a lot longer. And it was really only the visit of Blinken that forced his hand, but he actually had to do something.
Thank you. If it's confirmed, Getachew Reda has been elected as a chair of TPLF. What do you think? Is it a break from the mold? Meaning, given that he's of the younger generation, who was not part of the armed struggle, but of course the last 3 years were not easy either. But then, given that he may be in this position with a narrow margins, by a single vote, what does it say about the current status of the leadership? And there are different characterizations of his leadership or his possible leadership. Some say he's well-informed, articulate, so he knows the system, he knows the institutions, so he should be able to handle. He would be the right person since he was part of the Pretoria Agreement. Who would be the right person to go through the process? And others argue he's in the mold of Abiy, he's transactional, and may not be the best for building issues. Even if this is within 6 months, for 6 months to a year, what legacy, what impact do you think he would bring?
I think, how shall I put this? I think what Getachew has demonstrated in the last few months is the ability to turn on a dime. And, of course, we were all familiar with him, the positions that he took, very tough positions on issues like accountability, etc. And then the positions that he subsequently took. Now, if he is to be a leader of Tigray, he needs to turn on a dime again, and to, as you say, recognize that he does not command overwhelming support. He got more votes than the next candidate by one, but he didn't get even within TPLF, he did not get an outright majority of the votes. So, and of course there are many others in Tigray who are extremely critical of the TPLF leadership. And so it's not at all clear whether TPLF would command a majority or substantial part of a popular vote. So Getachew, if he is to lead Tigray, needs to do another term, and he needs to approach the people of Tigray with the modesty of somebody who was enjoyed his position as leadership during the war and now, courtesy of the effort, solidarity, sacrifice, commitment, and forbearance of the people of Tigray. And if he can do that, then he can fulfill. He can dress in the the robe suitable for that position. He will have a challenge because, of course, the nature of transactional politics in Addis Ababa is such that if he is to fit in there, he will be a courtier. He will be running around as a member of the court. So it requires a particular set of skills which we will time will tell whether he possesses.
Let's move. We'll get back into this subject, but let's move into accountability. You raised very important issues about the atrocities, mass atrocities that happened over the last 3 years, that continue to the injury of women, children, and border communities. How do you see, in light of Blinken's recent visit, holding his card during the visit, the most recent visit, and in contrast that with the recent decision by the ICC to hold Putin accountable?
Of course, speaking, if I were to speak as a lawyer, I would say that the particular reason why Putin can be held accountable is because the ICC has jurisdiction in Ukraine because the government of Ukraine invited them in as a sovereign government to investigate, and that can be done. And there's no prospect of anything comparable in Ethiopia and Tigray. But the wider point, of course, is that there is a blatant double standard here. And the double standard is not just that even whatever crimes Putin has committed are, the crimes of Abiy and Isaias are comparable or greater, and they are being ignored and belittled, even though there is pressure on coming from Congress and members of the administration to hold the line on accountability. The other thing that follows from this is actually just a lack of institutional attention. So one of the things that's quite striking about Washington and the State Department and national security today is their focus on Russia, Ukraine, and on China, Taiwan, and to a lesser extent on Iran, means that they just don't have the quality of people, the quality of analysis and understanding for other parts of the world. So the attitude, the approach to Africa is not only unprincipled, but it's actually stupid. It is actually not well thought through. And that is because they just haven't put the effort into thinking through how the US would best pursue its interests. And that relates to the accountability issue, because there is every reason within all those African charters and conventions and commitments to pursue accountability.
We'll come back into diaspora, particularly on this issue, given there was congressional pressure on Blinken, and his one of the reasons he had to deliver that message, or play the card. The diaspora's advocacy effort, it has been mentioned more than a few instances. If it was not for the diaspora initiative on making the agenda and persistent rally every single day for most of the year, and at least 2-3 times a week in front of the State Department, was one of the reasons they even started that they have not done before, the diaspora desk. The effort to put pressure on Congress, do you think the diaspora could still have an impact?
I think I think so, because not least because this is a bipartisan issue. This is not an issue that divides. It's almost uniquely not an issue that divides the parties in Washington. So I think that the two strands to accountability that can be pressed, two buttons that can be pressed. One is the obvious one of criminal accountability, and actually three. The second one is this aid accountability, which I think is a button that hasn't been pressed but will be quite effective. Why should we be, paying to rebuild things that have been destroyed by a government that we are paying? But the third is accountability within the US government. There's some really tough questions that the State Department has to answer for why it allowed the war crimes, the starvation to develop as they did. Why they opened the door for Isaias Afwerki. And nobody sees Isaias as anything other than a totalitarian at home and a destabilizer abroad. Why did they open the door to him? Why did they allow him to become the most powerful individual in the whole of the Horn? And so there's there's a policy accountability in Washington that should also be called for.
So dispersing between number of questions, we'll go back and forth, so they may not seem in some order. So question forwarded is, how can geopolitical developments in the Horn and the Arab Peninsula impact peace and security in the Horn of Africa? And how might this promote or hinder the Pretoria Agreement?
Sorry, I missed the very first part of it. How might developments in...
How can geopolitical developments in the Horn and the Arab Peninsula impact peace and security?
What happened under Trump, the Trump administration basically handed over strategy for that whole region to Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. And the Biden administration tried to pull back, but didn't get very far. So, each of those four still remains the dominant in one way or another. It will be interesting to see what the repercussions are of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, which obviously should be good news for Yemen and should mean less security concern for the Gulf states in the Horn. But I think one of the cards that we haven't properly played is the Israeli one, because despite the enormous problems that arise with this current Israeli government, there is still a sensitivity in Israel to moral issues around genocide. And I think perhaps the way into this isn't so much Israeli policy as such, but the Jewish and Israeli groups in Washington to try and get them to have some sympathies some more sympathies on this issue. I know that many of you have actually reached out to them, and it hasn't been easy. But I think the sort of containment of the fears that Israel, Saudi, and the Emirates had, that they were going to be facing major security threats in the Horn of Africa. I think that is, sorry, I'm saying this in a very convoluted way. Let me be clear that one of the reasons why these countries were so eager, so ready to rush into the politics of the Horn, and especially Ethiopia, was they feared genuine security threats arising from there. I think those security threats have massively lessened. I think they were exaggerated anyway, but they have lessened. And there should be an opportunity for building a sort of common ground, that it's not in anyone's interest to see further immiseration, further turmoil, further conflict.
So within, and a correction someone shared, which I hope one of the problems in Tigray is communication. That Getachew was not elected as the chair of TPLF, but rather president for the interim regional administration. So I stand to be corrected if that's the case, but you can speak to that. So the pragmatic state, assuming Ethiopia is heading that way, within the Pretoria confine, within the Ethiopian confine, can Tigray escape it? Would Tigray be able to change its course and the course of maybe even Ethiopia? Is it feasible? Is the exceptionalism of the Tigray people that was shown in the 17 years of struggle and were repeated in the last 3 years, can they pull that off?
Not on their own, I think, is the answer, and not quickly. But there is no alternative to trying, I think, is the main answer. There should be, and it within the narrow confines of the policy framework for reconstruction and rehabilitation, it can be done in a equitable, inclusive, efficient, people-led manner. That can happen, and that will deliver, and it can also become an attractor for international attention, because I think there's widespread dismay about the way in which humanitarian rehabilitation development efforts, not just in Ethiopia, but more widely, are becoming corrupted and subverted. And if it's possible to show again, this is another way of doing it. This is a way of doing it that actually is done with dignity, with equity, with the support of communities, that builds up social capital, that allows people to stand on their feet. That, I'm sure, that can attract attention and resources, and can become an inspiration for others too. But as I said, it's let's not pretend it's going to be either easy or quick. It's going to be another long and hard road. Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
What would be your best advice for the political party of Tigray to win the conflict and bring more partnerships from the international community?
I think, in a way, I would sort of reiterate the answer to the previous question, which is that holding the exercise of reconstruction and rehabilitation in Tigray to the highest standards, the legitimate expectations of the people is I think the way to do it. And I think it may be that the politics are going to, the high level politics, the interaction with Addis Ababa is going to be sort of corrupted by that encounter. That should not distort or affect or corrupt what happens in the towns and villages of Tigray. And I think finding ways in which the resources can go direct to the community level, directly to the community organizations, is really important.
So the new leader, whoever the case may be, and most likely Getachew in this case for the interim, what set of skills does the person need to bring and influence to bear to be successful in that position? Given particularly, he would have to serve a number of masters. He would have to live within the Pretoria framework, but then he has constraints in the border communities, which continue to suffer because of the presence of occupying forces from Amhara, from Eritrea, in particularly the Arab community, but Western Tigray, the entire Western Tigray, and Southern Tigray as well. And then, of course, the political how does that person survive serving all these masters?
That's a difficult question, and I'm glad I'm not in that position. I think it's important to point out the Pretoria Agreement really is not a political agreement at all. It's exactly what it says, which is a permanent cessation of hostilities. And that's a curious title, because a cessation of hostilities is almost by definition a temporary one. I've never seen a permanent one before. A cessation of hostilities is a very simple document to stop fighting. And basically a permanent cessation of hostilities just means we're going to stop fighting and not restart under any conditions, without specifying any of the political outcomes. And so it's scarcely counts as a peace agreement at all. And that's actually the other reason why I think it's taken so long, is because there's so much is up for negotiation. There's everything can really be can be bargained. The key thing that's in, and then there are a few things in there that were actually put in by the mediators, like accountability, like respect for human rights and for women and girls, which were put in, which are weak but nonetheless are there. They are hooks on which we could hang things. The bigger hook, the one significant political hook, is respect for the Constitution. And one of the ironies, as we all know, of this war is that actually it was the Tigrayans that were fighting to keep the Constitution, to uphold it, and the federal government that was fighting to turn it on its head. But one of the successes of the federal government's public diplomacy was to make out that it was the one upholding a legitimate constitutional order, rather than the other way around. And it was one of the failures of the government of Tigray public affairs leadership to make that argument. And because actually it was Getachew Reda who really failed to articulate that one, it would be interesting to see if he's able now to articulate the same argument in the context of the peace process, because it is still a process. But actually we need to have the constitutional boundaries of Tigray need to be restored. But of course, one of the great weaknesses of this agreement is there is no third-party oversight or reporting mechanism. It doesn't even report to the Peace and Security Council, in flagrant violation of the basic principles of African peace and security. So I think the particular skills and strategies that would be required would be first of all, find any means possible, now that there is some recognized agreement, for getting that underwritten, certified by the AU Peace and Security Council, and hopefully the UN Security Council, so that that constitutional principle can become a point at which the correct pressure can be brought upon the federal government to make sure that the constitutional boundaries are respected. Those boundaries may then be revised by a constitutional process, but they could not be, but the status quo ante has to be restored if the constitution is to be respected, because of the unconstitutional seizure of territory. So that's a particular strategy and skill set required, but
Are the people of Tigray doomed to the instruments of the regional African Union mechanisms?
Well,
They have other outlets?
There should be enough African leaders who recognize, I know there are some, but there should be enough who recognize that the AU's procedures have been extremely irregular and need to be corrected. And in doing that, they could correct it. Unfortunately, one of the things that was written into the agreement was debarring the government of Tigray from communicating with the international community, precisely because some of these points had been made in letters to the UN Security Council and the African Union and so on, by Debretsion, and that was probably the most effective public diplomacy, but that's now history. But there has to be a way of marshalling that African and international consensus around those issues. I think, is it going to happen within the Ethiopian political arena? Possibly, if alliances can be built. And one of the things that the TPLF did not do during the course of the war or since has been to really build a broader constituency of support across Ethiopia. And maybe that's another political, another dimension to politics that should not be neglected.
What are the lessons from Sudan, South Sudan, Somaliland, and others?
The lessons are that if you are skilled at presenting your case internationally, you can get quite a long way, and I think the diaspora here has been very effective. It was particularly in the early stages, became less so in the middle stages of the war, but crafting that message is crucially important. I think getting a harmonization between the political and the business community can be absolutely essential to not only getting the resources directed in the right way, but getting the harmony across those who influence politics. And crucially important is the cohesion and discipline of those with guns. So the making sure that the Tigray Defense Force, under whatever authority and name that they have going forward, remain disciplined, effective, accountable to, responsive, and sensitive to the people. And all those are pretty crucial.
A colleague of mine shared something of her concern, which should be shared among the wider audience, and have heard it oftentimes, unfortunately, is the role of women in the political affairs and future of Tigray. One disappointment that was shared was among the 5 or 6 candidates, there was no woman. Given what we have gone through the last 3 years and the disproportionate health and injury on women and the brand they continue to carry, what do you say is our political maturity and response to that?
I think that is absolutely a point to make. And the if there's to be a new Tigray and indeed a new Ethiopia, then the groups, beginning with women, but all sorts of groups who have not really been able to be included, to have their voices heard, need to be brought to the forefront. There's, as I'm sure you know, there are always calls and plans for national dialogue, and then you see, so who's going to be part of the national dialogue? Almost inevitably, it is the same old people who have been there, presided over the politics that led to this crisis, and of course, some of them resisted, some of them were, took honourable stances, but nonetheless, solutions are only going to be found if those whose voices weren't heard and those who have been, forced to pay unbearable prices, shoulder unbearable burdens, are given the opportunity of also having leadership, beginning with women.
The elephant in the room when it comes to regional security, Isaias Afwerki. And his recent travel to Kenya, Sudan's visit to Asmara, Russian involvement in the region. Should any effort be made to make sure Isaias is brought to ICC?
It's going to be hard to bring Isaias to ICC, but there are other options of countries that have universal jurisdiction, France, Belgium, Holland, bringing arrest warrants against him and his lieutenants for their crimes. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre and sad things is the way that through the sheer gullibility and stupidity, Isaias was sort of allowed to rehabilitate himself and be unleashed on the region. That said, I think there are many who are deeply aware of the danger that he poses, and it was interesting in his visit to Kenya. The Kenyan president, Ruto, was criticized for saying kind words about him and giving him a press conference. Let me give another angle on that, which is that Ruto knew he has to engage with Isaias. He invited him for a state visit, and Isaias did not want to do a press conference. In fact, he hates doing a press conference with anyone other than his own team journalists. But Ruto insisted. He said, if you come on a private visit, that's fine, but a state visit, you have to do a press conference. So Isaias responded, well, I will take one question and I need to know it in advance. And Ruto said, that's not how it works. In Kenya, we have a democratic country. this was deliberately set up so that Isaias could humiliate himself. The Kenyans knew exactly what they were doing, and of course, if you are a head of state and you are hosting another head of state, you have to say kind words about it. You understand this man is a fascist dictator and a mass murderer. You're not going to say it, but he was set up to make an idiot of himself in the press conference, and he did. He showed the world what he was made of, and well done to the Kenyans for that, because I don't think it was the one opportunity which will now recur for Isaias to show his true colours. And what that points to is the concern that quite a few African leaders have over the way in which Isaias himself is incredibly dangerous, and the Sudanese leadership know this too, and there are some Darfurians who are playing with him, but they also, the Sudanese know how far you can allow someone to go. They're quite sophisticated in this regard. The current government in Somalia too. So I think, and Abiy, of course, he was characterized by a senior diplomat as a rabbit going to have dinner with a python when he went to Asmara. And it was his gullibility that led Ethiopia into this crisis, but now we can't get out of it. But there is an awareness, not just in Africa, but also the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Israelis know, and many of the Emiratis, I don't think they've been told that MBZ is still enamored of Isaias, but basically everyone knows who he is. There just isn't a strategy for getting rid of him. But he's not going to have any defenders if people move against him.
Genocide is the highest crime, but also is an order that for some communities could give certain sense of urgency. In mind is the Iro community and the Kunama community. Is there not a statue that they can directly have access to and make their case? ICC or other UN mechanisms. The follow-up question with that is, do you and your organization, World Peace Foundation, have any plan to support exposing, documenting, and publishing genocide committed on the people of Tigray to ensure accountability and justice?
So, on the first question about genocide, the sad reality is that the Genocide Convention does not require states parties, such as the United States, to do anything when genocide is committed in another country. There is a misconception that identifying, declaring genocide puts a legal obligation on the country. It doesn't. And we saw this in Darfur in 2004, when there was a campaign in the United States, the Save Darfur campaign, declared Darfur a genocide and get the US to intervene. And what happened was that then Secretary of State Colin Powell declared it was a genocide, but he said, but our existing policy will not change, which was a policy of engagement, negotiation, humanitarian relief, etc. And that was a grave disappointment to the genocide advocacy group. And I had this discussion, I remember, in the beginning of the Tigray war and Tigray genocide. Don't put too much hopes on the genocide declaration for unlocking action, because it won't necessarily do that. and the same holds for these, these smaller communities which are under very, very serious threat, the Nama in Iran. So let us, but that doesn't, but even while we bring down our expectations for what would be the outcome of, bringing attention to the genocidal crimes committed against them, there are still plenty of avenues for bringing up their case at the UN, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which has been quite courageous on the Tigray issue. Not very effective, but you have to keep these things, alive, because there will, you may try a whole host of different routes of trying to get, universal jurisdiction accountability statements from parliaments, commissions to take them up, and most of them will not work. But if one does, then it's worthwhile trying. But I think the most important thing at this moment is documentation, and just continuing, relentless documentation, and getting journalists in there. And that's one of the shocking failings of the last few months is the modest attention by the international, the press of all kinds, to Tigray and to documenting what has happened there. We at World Peace Foundation, we're a small organization, but we will continue to do what we can. We're trying to facilitate the circulation and the publication of documentation of sexual and gender-based violence and starvation crimes in particular.
Within the confines of the Pretoria Agreement, again, or framework, is it feasible to build an open society within Tigray, a pluralistic society? It's a model on top of the paradigmatic state. Is there room for it?
Yes, there is. I mean, we look at earlier on I was criticizing the Pretoria Agreement for not really being a peace agreement. The only politics in there is really creation of interim authority and the constitutional issue. But by the same token, that Abiy and TPLF leadership have been negotiating over all these issues over months that are not specified in the agreement because the details simply aren't there. By the same token, it's possible for the Tigrayan people at home and in the diaspora to say, well, we have rights under the Constitution, which are explicitly recognized in this agreement. We have and we have rights that persist no matter what. Even if they're not in the Constitution, they are universal human rights, rights to democracy, governance, etc. They're there in the African Charter, the Constitutive Act, etc., etc., etc. The UN Declaration of Human Rights. So we can make these things happen and impose them on the authorities that are signatory to the agreement. There is the vagueness, the underspecification of the Pretoria Agreement should be seen as a plus, as an asset, as an opening for bringing about the kind of change we'd all like to see.
What would be the role of the diaspora in shaping that, in influencing that?
I think helping lead the conversation is one part. And another perhaps is pressing for international assistance to go direct to communities, for encouraging plural views, multiple media outlets, academic freedoms at the university, etc. All these things can contribute.
But would they be not only on accountability, on supporting governance, but in ensuring enlightened democracy, an open society, a pluralistic system in Tigray? Would they be able, the diaspora would have that role? If you can see the experience of, for instance, the Kosovars and others who had important role in influencing the shape of their home country. What are the lessons?
Diasporas can be extraordinarily important, and diasporas can in some cases foster extreme views or intransigent views. The diaspora can also the experience of diasporas is they can also be the most powerful source of lobby and advocacy on key issues like accountability, like monitoring, like that continuing documentation and scrutiny and playing that watchdog role can be enormously important.
Role of media has been one of the shortcomings of PPRD. There are so many private medias, not sure whether we can call them independent, and it's far in between in Tigray. What would be the development of a native media in propagating democracy within Tigray and advocating for Tigray?
Well, there are some really remarkable, courageous journalists who have who could be given a much more of a platform, and can be given a platform for a diversity of things, hosting debates, long form documentaries and investigations, all sorts of ways in which journalists can help bring others into the political dialogue. The media in the rest of Ethiopia, of course, there's no media at all in Eritrea, but the media in the rest of Ethiopia is woefully intimidated, etc. This could be an opportunity for making Tigray into the place of the freest media, which would be a massive.
Would you think that would be a ticket?
I'm sorry?
Would you think that would be a ticket?
A ticket in what sense?
Well, as an outlet with a vibrant media for Tigray to advocate its rights.
I think of that as just an unalloyed plus. I can't see a minus to it. I think it has to happen, and it will. And apart from anything else, just for people who have suffered these absolutely outrageous abuses, violations, hardships, to be able to feel that their voice is heard.
Well, thank you, Alex. There are a number of issues. I think we're going to come back and have more conversation. This is going to raise a lot of conversation, and I think this is just the first. The intent is for the people of Tigray, the larger audience, particularly those who are listening directly, with access to English language and capable to get it. And I think our media friends would also make this available in Tigray now. So the idea is to have this conversation. But one thing that brings such crisis and really paralysis is not only to bring solution, but to avoid any source of conflict that would lead to violence. So we have a world of serious debate, but then an outcome of a mature political process. And because you are part of it, we are very grateful. As always, we really appreciate it. But I want to give you the chance for a parting remarks, even though this is not the last one.
I think your last point there is fundamentally important, which is that it's crucially important that the intracommunal and intercommunal violence that is scarring so much of Ethiopia does not come within the community of the Tigrayans, and that sense of respect, of communal solidarity, of tolerance, forbearance, and civility is maintained. And despite, of course, there's a diversity of political views. We can have all sorts of opinions about the leadership and when, what was done right and what was done wrong at different times during the war. But let us, debate these issues openly, of course, but with without threat, without coercion, without silencing, without any violence, and then on that basis, it's possible to move forward and see a brighter future.
Thank you, Alex. This has been wonderful. We'll continue to have you, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Mo nay lomaanti madawna Miss Alex ودينا لنا زينا مجمري أيو تمسسال برنامج كتوليوم هم تفوتوا في لايزانا قدام مدب كلنا لتنا بحال تجراي تو كلير لا تسفن نبر بزحال تفلالي حسابات اليوم تفلالي راح يكونوا ولا تسابقت من حسابات ثم تسابقت حسابات جن تسابقت تجارة يكونوا عندي بتعمل عوي مكراي شجرين يحزونا بالتفلالي direction وين مخدية بعد خدم دلنا أبز من قد جزيجن بزح تختوخ الليو جنزير جن برسلات تقستين بلبا من النت العزازة من يمكن خلينا كفتفولي جورلنا إنت exceptionalism بحال بوتسيد كنور طوينا ولك exceptionalism أو بحال طوين so لاب خلوت برنامجنا الممر زينا TMH مقبل عملت يخبروا هزل لايف حلفوا يوم ويحلفوا لهم so تا مستوى بعلو هلا تحلي كم دوا ويكفل تاخذ ديو لكن just كيس اللي حلي وينو مارك أسرش الشعنتة زين أقدر يحلون معتي كتاجور لي سلالي لو كالندم سلالة بابان موران مرحت كميتين ميديان ساتو كل مدرخ تدالنا نتكلم ندقفور نتحدثنا نتكلم ندقفورلو إنه معتي سالة أونلاين student قد تفهم بري ويبل لا sorry okay نادعتي إيش دقاف بكتبتلو إيفنت اللي أنا نقل أسشعر مرة أسشعر برلو ولا إنا كنحوس أو اليوم هي ولدها مالتي الميديا استجرنا يوميتنا لما عند حدي وكفتم أجندة كبر ورايو بدافعهم أي هم مالتي ما بتعمي نمسكن بأيه بتزيد دالوتين أجندة زي كنحبين مناي ولا دلخونة حرفة منها تحليله تحتنا اللي قبرناي من خجور زيتين زي سنة دالو زي حالات النتوسل لها ونالو ما عندك قبرة لا هو حالات النتوسل إلى تسفى يقبر من حرت في أنا يأكاد ناتو ناتو حوالاتي هوني ما خبرتي هذا اللي يغني اللي سلام خلنا يكون لنا سكع الحمزة لومي خدام مقالة مثلا عبي مدرخ كلنا أيو لخالد حوالنا حوالنا نقولنا أوروبا للخوم أو خالد ساعات لي لوتخم هذا اللي يقريتها نطير ما بليني قالت إن حلي هاللي فالوت نبيع مزبور نرفي الدالي.
Thank you سلام حوي كم أنا خاطكم دحناتكم I hope كلها نسلام منا صبوا program كامل حلا منا مزمور تداري يوميو I think Mark حوي to screen share stop مسكرة I'm gonna go ahead. Thank you. هلا up to chat tonight tip have مقارنة من PMH link تصديق يومينا نسوون النار أنا يتصحون في أخلاقنا تكلمنا في تكلمنا مالك. Thank you.